I'm very glad to welcome you all to this Humane Philosophy Project Ian Ramsey Centre seminar event. Thank you all for coming. I'm really delighted to introduce to you today Dr. Mark Hocknull. Mark is actually an ideal speaker for this event in that he holds doctorates both in science from UCL and in religious studies from Lancaster University. And in addition to that, he's also a humane philosopher and indeed principal lecturer in philosophy at Lincoln University, previous to which he was the Chancellor of Lincoln Cathedral. Mark's research interests include theology, philosophy of evil, ethics, and science and religion. And today he's going to speak to us on the topic. Just scroll up so I don't miss it. Does anyone know what it's going to be? It's going to be on the topic evil and the myths we live by. So please join me in giving Mark a very warm welcome.
When I was an undergraduate, we invited the then editor of Nature to give a talk to our microbiology society in the university where I was studying. And we gave him a huge introduction, said all the things he'd done. And his response to our description of his career was, "You've just described a man who doesn't know what he's doing and can't make up his mind." And I kind of remembered that as Ralph was talking about the different things I'd done. So lecture in philosophy is my current incarnation, as it were. I'm going to talk about evil and the myths we live by. And the ideas in this talk have really grown out of some work I did getting on for 20 years ago now, when I started 20 years ago now, when I did some work on a theologian called Wolfhart Pannenberg. He was a German Lutheran theologian who was known for his strange ideas about the ontology of the future, and the priority of the future. And because of that, because everything, God's kingdom, grew from the future, according to Pannenberg, people developed this idea that Pannenberg's theology was optimistic and couldn't cope with the darker side of life. And I found that quite puzzling and intriguing. And I spotted a gap in the market, as it were, and did some research on what Pannenberg thought of evil. And then having completed that, I began to think, well, could you explain all this in secular terms? Do you actually need God to make evil comprehensive? So this is an attempt to be philosophical rather than theological, and see if we can make sense of evil in a purely kind of secular sort of framework. So I'm going to start with a little bit of history of ideas of evil. And what I'd like to suggest to you is if we look at what people have taken as evil at different periods in history, we find that they mean different things by evil. And what I'm suggesting is we've got three paradigm cases of events that we regard or have been regarded as evil events in history. So the first paradigmatic event would be the Lisbon Earthquake in the 18th century. Struck Lisbon on the 1st of November, All Saints' Day, when a huge proportion of the population, very devout, were in church. The earthquake initially destroyed lots of buildings in the city, a disproportionate amount of churches, which, because it was All Saints' Day, were full, so an awful lot of the population died as they were at prayer in church. And the surviving population came down to the big square on the river in Lisbon to escape any potential falling buildings, where they discovered that the water in the river had receded. And as they were puzzling about what had happened here, a great tsunami came in and killed even more people. And over the ensuing days, there were lots more deaths due to fire outbreaks in the city. All of this was happening, of course, at the Enlightenment, when people were beginning to, well, more than beginning to, but were questioning the idea of God's providence and God's care of people. And up until then, the kind of classical way of understanding evil was to divide it into two categories: physical evil, natural evil, which would be things like earthquakes, which were thought often to express either God's judgment or were messages calling for repentance on the part of a population, and moral evil, which in this particular paradigm would be, I guess we call that sin in a Christian context. And what this event triggers is a huge kind of soul searching across Western Europe. An intellectual kind of quest for understanding. And the settled view that emerges from this event is that earthquakes are just that, natural disasters. There's no divine intent or purpose behind them. The world doesn't speak of divine providence. Instead, the response we make to events like earthquakes is to seek to understand them. So if we can't prevent them from happening, we can at least prepare for them. And that's exactly what they did in Lisbon. And to this day, seismologists still consult the data that was collected at the time after the Lisbon earthquake. For our purposes, evil transforms from no longer do we accept the idea of earthquakes, floods, other natural disasters, and disease as instances of natural evil. They're just natural phenomena. Instead, evil becomes a moral thing. It's a purely moral concept. It's to do with what human beings do or fail to do. Whereas before it was considered in a kind of metaphysical way a failure to be quite what we should be. Now it's a moral thing, and it's a failure for us to behave and do the right things. And the solution to the problem of evil is progress. And that's kind of what the Lisbon earthquake sets up for us. The response to the earthquake is to understand it and to build ways of understanding what might happen so that we can avoid some of the more severe effects of natural disasters. So the solution is scientific and technological progress allied to moral progress. And that paradigm bumps along quite happily right through the 18th, 19th centuries and begins, I think, to crumble historically at the beginning of the 20th century, and certainly by the end of the Second World War. It's collapsed completely because the second paradigm event that I'd like to suggest marks out a historical shift is the Holocaust. And the reason, it's difficult to kind of express this without sounding like I'm trivializing the Holocaust. I don't mean that the reason that 6 million people's deaths were so significant. That's not what I mean. But why it's paradigmatic, why the Holocaust is paradigmatic, I think, is because it's impossible to murder 6 million people in that space of time without the technological tools available to us. In other words, the tools of scientific progress and technological progress are the very things that are meant to help us overcome evil, are the very things that are used for human destructiveness, for evil purposes. And in doing that, what that shows us also is that we failed miserably to make any kind of moral progress across human history. So that's my second paradigmatic case. Now, it marks the collapse, if you like, of the idea of moral progress, scientific progress, overcoming the problem of the existence of evil. And my third one, this is where I think we are now. If you look at the ways we use the word evil, the connections we use the word evil now, we tend to reserve it for huge events of suffering, for mass genocide. And I think that links to what happened after the Second World War with the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this is a clause from that declaration. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. That's a clause in the Declaration of Human Rights. And what the history of the 20th century and the 21st century shows us is that's exactly what we don't do as a human population. So this is the killing fields. This is a memorial, a collection of human remains from the killing fields. So those are my three suggestions for three paradigmatic events that illustrate how the concept of evil that we've worked with historically has gradually changed over time. And that might lead us to conclude that evil is a purely human social construct as a concept, that we have this concept that we fill with a content that fits us at the time. And we could rest, I guess, with that kind of temporal relativism. But I wanted to probe a little bit deeper. So can we find something that's a fixed or a constant underneath that temporal flux? It was the question I set about asking myself. And I began, first of all, by thinking about how we use the language of evil. How do we use the word? And it's quite tricky, I think, to get hold of, because it actually does, the word evil actually does two things for us. It covers both evil done, and I call that wickedness, in old Christian language, it's sin, but wickedness, doing evil, inflicting harm perhaps in our contemporary paradigm. So it's evil done, evil inflicted, and evil endured, suffering. And the word evil covers both of those aspects of wickedness and suffering. So any theory of evil, I think, has to take account of those two components. It has to account of wickedness perpetrated, evil perpetrated, and evil endured, suffering. And then the word itself, it can be either an adjective, in which case it just describes a particular object as a particular example of that thing. So we might say of a glass of wine, it's evil. Or we might say of a person, that's an evil person. That doesn't mean people are evil. It means that particular person we are ascribing as evil. It's an adjective. Sometimes it can be used as a noun, in which case it names something. And the most common thing that it names in the late 20th, early 21st century is suffering. And one of the most significant secular theories of evil that I consider them one of the most significant secular theories of evil is that of Claudia Card, an American moral philosopher, who describes or defines evil as intolerable suffering. So the noun, evil, names this thing, intolerable suffering. But if you think about that, all that's doing is naming a particular kind of suffering as evil. It's describing a particular kind of suffering as evil. In other words, the noun, if we use the word evil as a noun, it collapses into an adjective. But we could also use it as an abstract noun, which doesn't refer to anything. And what it does, it describes a state of affairs. So there is no thing that is evil, if evil is an abstract noun. We can't distill evil and bottle the essence of evil and distribute it. There's nothing there. And I think that the classic theologians and philosophers, people like St Augustine and Plato, captured something of that in their philosophies and theologies of evil as a privation. For Augustine, a privation of good, a falling short of what a person should be or what an object should be. So that's the language. It seems to me that the language points us in the direction of seeing evil in that classical way, not as something positively existing, but as a lack of something that's missing, a privation in some way. And that's where I'm going to go in this talk. So to give the game away, I'm going to suggest that the thing that's missing and the thing that qualifies something as evil is a lack of meaning in human life. And I'll try and explain and fill that idea out as we go through. So the next slide is called Evil and Meaning Making. Modern Western philosophical tradition, as I've alluded to already, treats evil as a moral category. We don't bother, as philosophers on the whole, with the idea of physical evil anymore. We treat it as a purely human moral phenomenon. I've read one or two contemporary authors that try and reclaim the categories of natural evil, but they're fighting an uphill battle. And it's just not in our intellectual framework to think like in those terms. We just don't think of disease as evil. We can think of it as a horrible thing and something to be defeated. And we can sometimes use the language metaphorically, but we don't think, for example, of the cancer or the infection as evil. We see it as an infection or a gene that's gone wrong in some way. We reserve the word evil exclusively, it seems to me, for moral things. It's a moral category, and it's moral philosophers who talk about evil. So we talk about evil as a moral category, but my contention is that when we do that, we actually fail to capture how we use the word evil in normal, everyday language. That reducing evil to being a moral category actually means that we've lost something in the way that we use the language. So right from the beginning, if we're attempting to produce a moral theory of evil, we're doomed to failure, because we're simply not focusing on the whole concept. We're just focusing on one small part of it. And to give you an idea of what I mean by that, think of something that you would label evil, something like genocide, for example. If it's a moral, if that genocide, if that evil is a moral category, then we should and there's no residual thing left over, then we should just be satisfied with saying it's an extremely morally bad thing to do, to commit genocide. But that doesn't capture quite what we mean when we say that genocide is evil. And it doesn't matter how many extremely bads we put in front of the object before we say it's really morally bad. It doesn't matter how much we intensify that, there is still something left over. There's still an excess of understanding and meaning that's not captured and not explained by the language. There's always something that we haven't quite captured. So genocide, we rightly say, is evil. It's not extremely morally bad. It doesn't feel right to say that genocide is morally wrong. It is, but it doesn't feel right it doesn't feel that we've caught quite what we mean by just saying it's extremely morally bad. When we deploy the language of evil, I think we mean and we intend something else, something beyond the scope of the moral. So evil is not a moral category at all. It's the thing that actually breaks our moral categories. And what I'd like to suggest to you is that the common theme historically, right from the Lisbon Earthquake example of a paradigm shift, the Holocaust, and our current one of suffering, the common thing that links all of those paradigms is meaninglessness. That's what I'm going to suggest and argue for in a second. And to illustrate what I mean, to help you get a grip on what I'm thinking, I'm going to use as a foil Claudia Card's theory of evil, which she proposed in her book, The Atrocity Paradigm. I think it is, in terms of moral philosophy, I think it is one of the, if it's not one of the best, I think it's the most comprehensive moral theories of evil that modern philosophy has offered as a solution to the problem of understanding evil. And what Card suggests is that there are two components to evil. She considers harm, which is considered to render the life of a person suffering that evil as either impossible or intolerable. So the harm that's being done is so intense that life becomes intolerable or impossible for that person to continue. It's the suffering that's the problem in terms of evil. It's not death in itself. Card doesn't think that death is an evil. She thinks that's a natural part of human life. But it's the idea of intense suffering which makes a person's life intolerable or impossible. So that would equate to how we use that language of evil, that word evil. This is harm, this is evil suffered, evil endured. But she also has a second element, to evil, which is culpability. That suffering has to be inflicted by an agent, thinks Card, and it has to be inflicted in a culpable way, in a way that renders the person inflicting the suffering worthy of blame for the act or the decision that's inflicted the suffering. So the person who's acting to cause the harm has to be both responsible for the action or the decision they took, and has to know in advance that intolerable suffering will result from that action. So as I've suggested, she captures the two aspects of evil: evil committed and evil endured. So it's a really neat, comprehensive theory explaining evil as a moral category. But I don't think it goes quite far enough. So here's a little thought experiment for us to think through. What we have to imagine is four people all suffering from the same, I say potentially fatal, it is fatal, the same fatal disease for which there's a treatment available, but our four people, for one reason or another, don't get the treatment that they need to cure them of this disease. And the reason they don't get the treatment varies for each person. So person A is a convicted prisoner serving a life sentence in a prison and has treatment deliberately withheld as part of a research project into the pathology of the disease. We might want to go a bit further and say not only is the treatment withheld, but the prisoner was deliberately infected without their knowledge. Okay, so that's person A. Person B is just unaware that they have the disease until it's beyond the point where treatment is effective. Person C knows that they're infected, but they live in a remote part of the country and there's very little infrastructure available and very few medical resources available. And so person C has no access to medical resources, no access to treatment. And person D lived and died 200 years ago, before the disease was adequately understood and before any treatment for the disease was developed. All four of those people undergo intolerable suffering. But only person A experiences evil, because there's no one culpable for the outcome of person B, C, and D's prognosis. No one's culpable for them contracting the disease. Only person A is suffering as the result of someone's culpable decision. So only person A, on Claudia Card's account, suffers evil. Well, person C is quite an interesting one, because you could argue that there may be culpable reasons why the infrastructure is not in place in the country, why the medical resources aren't available, and why she has no access to them. You could argue that there's culpability there. So you could argue possibly that person C also experiences evil. But you can see that evil only results on Card's theory where there's a culpable decision. It's nothing to do with the quantity of suffering as such. It's only the combination of culpability and suffering. So let's take the disease metaphor and see if we can just destructively test this idea of someone making a decision to deliberately cause harm or suffering, and see if we can destructively test it a bit. So what we have to do now is imagine now a small isolated colony somewhere suffering from an outbreak of perhaps this same disease, for which there's no cure unless the disease is caught and treated in the very early stages of its development, and there's no vaccination to protect against this disease. Okay? So that's the situation that I'm asking you to imagine. A small isolated colony, communications are quite difficult, transport is quite difficult, the colony has become host to an outbreak of this fatal disease. In all cases, if it's not treated, it will be fatal. So, because of the transport links, because of the high risks of the infection spreading, the colony is cut off, and the resources in the colony are becoming scarce. And medicine supplies are dwindling, and they're proving ineffective anyway in halting the spread of the disease. The governor of the colony notices that the disease is actually at the moment confined to quite a small area, a specific area of the colony. And so he decides to have the area sealed off, cordoned off. A drastic measure to save the majority of the population, he decides, but condemning those inside the cordon to almost certain death if they become infected, and no palliative care, no effective treatment. And once inside the cordon, once it's sealed off, I guess the darker sides of human nature take over, and they're facing not just all that prospect of unendurable suffering and painful death, but also the collapse and breakdown of the rule of law, which is going to compound the sufferings as well. Talking about the breakdown of the rule of law in that context reminds me of a government pamphlet that was produced at the height of the Cold War, which seriously suggested that one of the serious side effects, consequences of a nuclear strike on this country would be the collapse of the banking system. That might have been the least of our worries at the time, but anyway. So, I'm suggesting that in this situation, under Claudia Card's definition of evil, what we have is a case of evil. Because the suffering that's inflicted on those inside the cordon who are condemned to contract the disease and die was foreseen. And a responsible decision was taken to seal them off, seal them in to the cordon, and let the disease take its course. So that qualifies on Card's definition of evil as a clear case of evil. But we might argue, and moral philosophers would argue, some would, that the governor's decision was, after all, a moral one. And it's, I guess, not too difficult to see how they might do that. If you're a strict utilitarian, you could argue that the governor's decision was actually sound. It's ruthless, but it was the strong decision that had to be taken in order to save the majority of the population of the colony. It's a pure mathematical calculation, the needs of the many against the needs of the few. And it's unfortunate that they suffer in the way that they do, the people in the cordon, but what else could we do? And in the grand scheme of things, it was the right decision because it maximises the survival and maximises the positive outcome of the decision. It's morally the right thing to do, we might argue, on a utilitarian basis. But we might say, yes, but what about John Rawls's objection? We can't really trade different groups of people's well-being in this way. We can't trade this half of the room's well-being and happiness against that half of the room's well-being and happiness. That's just not what you're allowed to do with human beings. So if you're a utilitarian, you might argue that. If you're more Kantian, or if you're a Rawlsian moral philosopher, you would counter that and say, no, those things are just not things you're allowed to do to other human beings. And therefore, Claudia's definition of this as a case of evil stands. It is an evil act. It's an immoral act. But let's try something different. Suppose those infected with the disease agree to be quarantined. Suppose the governor has time to consult with everybody. I don't know. They have a vote, and 52% of them say yes, we agree to be quarantined or something. But let's say they all agree to be quarantined, and then Rawls' objection vanishes because I'm not allowed to trade your well-being against mine, but my well-being is mine, and I am allowed to trade my well-being for anyone else. In other words, I can sacrifice something of my own. So Rawls' objection vanishes. And I think even the most ardent Kantian of moral philosophers would have to agree that if everybody agreed to be cordoned off, even the most ardent Kantian would have to agree that the decision to quarantine was a morally acceptable and justifiable one, because the people concerned are making the decision for themselves. They're preserving their own dignity, human dignity, in Kantian terms. So that would be a morally permissible decision to make. But now we have a rather interesting scenario, because we have clearly a group of people who are about to suffer intolerably, which will make life impossible for them. And they're going to suffer intolerably and impossibly as a result of a moral decision or a decision responsibly made, knowing that that decision will create harm and suffering. In other words, we've fulfilled Claudia Card's 2 criteria for defining what constitutes evil. Suffering, intolerable suffering undergone as the result of a responsible decision. And yet the decision is a moral one. I didn't take a straw poll, but I'm willing to bet that everybody would agree that if the people who are going to suffer agree to be quarantined, it's a morally right decision to make. They alone can make that decision. It's still a decision that they've made responsibly, and from which great suffering results. So it constitutes evil in that sense. So we have a situation where there is evil in a morally correct situation as the result of a right moral decision. And that doesn't feel quite right. And that's why I think evil shatters our normal moral categories. Can we explain how we've arrived at this situation of evil resulting from the correct moral decision? And I think we can. Because I think the missing component in our analysis of what constitutes evil is this idea of meaning, or rather absence of meaning. So I want to reinstate the old idea of evil as a privation, as something lacking that we feel we should properly have. And rather than Augustine's idea of a lack of good, of falling away from the ideal of goodness, I'd like to suggest that it's a lack of meaning, an absence of meaning that constitutes something being evil. And this idea also will help us to resolve the paradox we've got ourselves into over the part of the colony that's agreed to be cordoned off and to suffer in the way that it has. So the quarantine is now set in a totally different context. The suffering, the reason that we hesitate and draw back from calling it evil, even though it satisfies Claudia Card's criteria, the reason we draw back from it is that suddenly it's given meaning. Those who suffer are not victims of a fate beyond their control. It becomes a result of the exercise of their freedom and their humanity. There's a kind of nobility about the suffering that's given because they've made that decision themselves. They're willingly sacrificing themselves for the good of their neighbours, as it were. And because of that sense of self-sacrifice, if you like, the sting in the tail of the suffering, the evil, is taken away. It's no longer evil, though it's suffering inflicted as a result of a responsible decision. So it's not intolerable suffering, as Claudia Card suggests, but useless, senseless, or meaningless suffering that defines evil. The quantity of the suffering, in a sense, is irrelevant. It's, if you like, the existential component. Does it have meaning? Is it meaningless? Is it pointless? And that also, I think, fits with the Holocaust. It defines the real extent of the evil that is represented in the Holocaust. because even in its own twisted logic, the final solution fails to achieve any solutions. It's utterly pointless. There's no good thing that can come out of murdering 6 million people that couldn't have arisen in some other way. In that sense, the meaning is the evil, the suffering undergone in the Holocaust, all those deaths, is meaningless. And that's not, I don't mean that to water down the significance of those 6 million deaths at all. My intention is to intensify it and make them even more, make the Holocaust even more evil, as it were, than it was. I'm not trying to water it down by saying that those deaths were meaningless. If you can give meaning to something, you can redeem it. You can make something positive out of it. And real evil is something that is irredeemable and is utterly without purpose and utterly without meaning. So that's my suggestion. Not intolerable suffering, but useless, senseless, or meaningless suffering is the thing that defines evil. Why is that so? I think there's a human instinct. I call it an instinct. It's an intuition. It's a basic drive for us to seek meaning. We're, if you like, in kind of anthropological terms, naturalistic terms, we are storytelling apes. We are meaning-making apes. That's what we are as creatures. We tell stories. We give meaning to our lives and to the events that happen around us. It's what we do as human beings. And it's part of that meaning-making is to seek to bring good out of bad situations. And where we can't do that, or where something so contradicts our basic meaning-making stories, where we can't find meaning, we categorise that as evil. And that's the difference between genocide being extremely morally bad and being evil. It has no purpose. It has no meaning. It's utterly destructive for destruction's sake. So evil, I'm suggesting, is a privation of meaning. I'm giving it a metaphysical definition once again. I'm trying to reclaim metaphysics as a tool for understanding evil. It's futility, it's a wastefulness of human life. And it fits, it's those things because we as human beings are meaning-making beings. So something without meaning contradicts and threatens our very nature. It threatens who and what we are as human beings. It's a fundamental threat to our humanity, in other words. So in the days of Augustine and Plato, we quite happily talk of things in the world, natural things, physical things, being evil. We tend not to do that these days. But if we change our understanding of evil from a moral category back to a metaphysical one, a lack of a privation of meaning, then we can begin to find a way of maybe understanding natural evil in a different way to the way Augustine managed to do it, which was natural evil was a punishment for sin, for moral evil. Maybe we can understand natural evil in a slightly different way. So what I'm doing is I'm linking meaningless and evil as wastefulness or futility. What I'm suggesting is that evil is essentially futile. It's futility, it's senselessness, wastefulness. Genocide is a waste of human life. It's senseless stuff. And that leads me to link, that idea of wastefulness links to entropy, which is a thermodynamic concept introduced in the 19th century to explain originally the inefficiency of steam engines in terms of heat loss. So in a thermodynamically closed system, the potential energy always decreases at the expense of an increase in entropy. There's energy is wasted, is lost. And I discovered quite recently that there's also, as well as thermodynamic entropy, in the 1920s, Claude Shannon, who was instrumental in founding modern computer technology, he realised that George Boole's symbolic logic could be converted into transistors and expressed electronically, which is the basis of modern computers. Before he did all that, in the 20s, he was working for the Bell Company on telephone signals and telephone lines, and he coined the term information entropy to talk about the loss of information in a telephone signal as it's sent. So it's a general, in other words, what I'm suggesting is entropy is a general thing for inefficiency, for wastefulness, for loss, and for general winding down. If we think of the universe as a thermodynamically closed system, entropy suggests to us that the fate of the universe is a slow winding down, a gradual cooling of potential energy, a gradual loss of potential energy, until we get to the point where nothing can happen anymore. Bertrand Russell once said that philosophy has to come to terms with the fact that the future of the universe is that it doesn't have a future at all, that everything is futile. And philosophy has to come to terms with that. And I'm suggesting that this is one way of articulating that futility through this principle of entropy, is to suggest, to reclaim the concept of natural or physical evil. And the connection is this, really. It's true, in a closed system, the potential energy in that system always decreases at the expense of entropy. But if you have an open system, you can import energy into that open system, and you can use that to drive synthetic reactions. That's exactly what life does. That's how life works at the biochemical level, at the quantum level, at the physical level. It's exactly how it works. It takes energy from somewhere else and uses that energy release, captures it to drive synthetic reactions, to create life, to create all the structures that make life possible. In other words, life is impossible in our universe without this idea of entropy, without this idea of futility and wastefulness. Life is parasitic upon this futility idea. Life itself is a temporary reversal, a temporary victory of gaining significance and meaning against the backdrop of futility and pointlessness. The physical life is a temporary victory in a battle that, if Russell's right and the physics is right, and all there is entropy, will ultimately be lost. We cannot win. We cannot win the war, but we can win some battles in that war, and we can create meaning against a backdrop of pointlessness. So finding meaning is a battle won in a war that can only be lost. So that's my kind of philosophically constructive proposal, I think, claiming that evil we can reclaim as a metaphysical concept, and that we can use this idea of entropy to link it once again to an idea of natural evil, and the thing that ties them both together is meaninglessness. I think the last slide, that's just a summary of what I've done. Basically, I feel I've come full circle. The reason the Escher picture is there, with these people endlessly going round and round, is I think I've come full circle. I've moved from the classical idea of evil as privation, worked through the historical developments, and come back to an idea of evil as, once again, a metaphysical idea in terms of privation. So, thank you.
Thanks very much, Mark, for that extremely interesting and wide-ranging talk. We have about 20 minutes available now for Q&A, and I can see that there are several questions in the room already. I'd ask you before, oh my goodness, before asking your question, to wait for the mic to make its way to you, just so it's picked up on our recording equipment. And we'll start with Andrew Pinsent. And if you could, I'll try to pass the mic around, but if you can collaborate with that, we'll manage it better.
Thank you very much for addressing this difficult topic philosophically. I have a dangerous liaison objection.
Mm-hmm.
So back in the Enlightenment, the Lisbon Earthquake scandalised Europe. There's also a book, a pre-revolutionary French book called Dangerous Liaisons, where a couple set out to corrupt a young girl in order to get revenge on the nobleman that she's going to marry. And people were really shocked with that because it seemed the object of the couple was to destroy the girl morally. And yet, I'm not sure how that would fit exactly into your description of meaninglessness as sort of the key idea of evil. I'd like to comment on that. Thank you.
So the idea that it was to destroy someone.
Yes.
Yeah. And to what end?
Ultimately, so the older woman, I think, the couple who set out to do this, so she can have her revenge on the nobleman the young girl's going to marry. I think that's how it works.
So revenge. So, okay. And are you suggesting that's an evil act or a moral act?
Well, it was certainly seen in Enlightenment Europe as an example of an unfathomable evil.
Okay.
So this book became a source of great scandal.
Okay. Right. Okay. Yeah. Right. Well, I don't think that pre-Enlightenment it's not just
Pre-revolutionary, so that's what I meant to say. Pre-revolutionary France.
Okay. So, well, even then, it's not that evil is considered as physical, natural, and moral. So there's still that moral evil there, and there's a moral sense, I think, that revenge is not a good thing. And it sounds like, I don't know the book, I haven't read the book, so but it sounds like the base motive that's unfathomable. The idea that what's the ground for that revenge? Augustine in his Confessions, when he's describing a childhood theft of pears, he says, "Oh, I had no reason to take the pears. The pears on my parents' estates were much better than these anyway. I just chucked them away and gave them to the pigs. It was just the sheer pleasure of doing something wicked." And it's that you. How can you give meaning to wanting to enjoyment of something wicked for wickedness' sake? That's possibly how I'd respond to it. Evil's irrational, I guess.
I certainly agree evil is irrational. This might not be very fair asking 3 questions consecutively.
They've got to be very short if we're going to, there's lots.
Okay, I'll try to be very quick. So, suppose that I help a friend to find meaning in the suffering that they're going through. Help me to better understand this. Does this then mean that the meaning before I help them find meaning, does that suffering then in retrospect no longer become evil? Does the prior suffering with no meaning being recognized?
Okay. Yes. Well, in my case, in my example there, the thing that disarms, if you like, the evil is finding meaning and purpose in it. It doesn't take away the scale of the suffering.
Sure.
But it does, finding meaning, if you like, redeems the evil. So it's hard to kind of say in purely abstract terms whether that would be right. But I think I'd want to say it does formally take away the evil because it redeems it. Doesn't mean it's not morally wrong.
Sure. Okay, so that leads to the next question too. If evil is suffering that is incapable of having meaning, was something you kind of hinted at before, does that mean that evil is, or the meaning component part, is that object or subjective? For example, let's suppose that everybody in the room can see that there's meaning, like you're growing from the suffering that you're going through, but I can't get you to recognize it.
Yeah.
Is it, how is it, how necessary is it for you to recognize the meaning?
Yeah, it's a good question. Because the other side of that would be somebody who finds meaning in something else that the rest of us find trivial. And does that count as well? I think we could formally again say good will come out of it, and maybe you can't see that now, but you will see it eventually. So it's a process of time. So I think formally we can say it's not evil, even though it's not pleasant. It's bad suffering.
Okay, thank you. And lastly, you said that finding meaning is a battle won in a war that can only be lost.
Mm-hmm.
Then ultimately, does that not make the battle futile?
Possibly, and that's part of my that's part of the dilemma. It's part of the exploration of whether evil is a irreducibly theological concept, or whether it can be turned into a secular one. Because it does leave open that question. If that analysis is right, it does say that we're all doomed ultimately, but you can still create meaning in your life, and you can still find purpose in your life. So for your life, for the duration of your life, the battle's won. So the war, as you experience it, you've won it. So, but if you look at it in the bigger, wider global context, it does mean, I think, that evil is futility ultimately is triumphant. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm sure you are familiar with Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning,
Mm-hmm.
and himself being the Holocaust victim and survival. He approaches meaning as a tool only to prevent one sort of degradation, if you will, in face of evil. But I think that defining evil as meaning, the absence of meaning, would go against the notion of what Holocaust survivors themselves describe and experience. And as an example, you said that if it has no meaning, then it is no evil.
Right.
Labor camps, if I may.
Okay. Right.
You can argue that labor camps have meaning because it was just to produce labor.
Okay.
So, and also the language, noun and adjective you spoke about. Stalin would be the adjective or personal name which can identify with evil, like Hitler, like any other names.
Okay. Right.
Thank you.
Okay. When I said that the Holocaust was meaningless, what I kind of had in mind was if we look at it from the mindset of the perpetrators, it's there with a particular purpose, you know, and that purpose in itself is wrong, but it's also something that even within that twisted logic, the Holocaust, the final solution failed to achieve any solution at all. So even within that twisted logic, it's already failed, and it's meaningless in that sense, in that twisted logic of that regime. That's what I meant by meaninglessness. And I certainly wouldn't want to criticise anybody who's survived an experience like that for finding meaning and finding some redemption in that experience at all. That's not. I didn't quite mean that when I said I thought that the Holocaust was meaningless. I meant within that logic, it's unfathomable because it's never going to. The intent was evil, and the proposed solution was always going to be doomed to failure. And so it's meaningless in that sense.
But language also.
Oh, the Stalin thing. The Stalin thing.
It's a personal name.
Well, we can use Starling, I guess, as a kind of synonym for evil, but it's an adjective, isn't it? He's an example of a human being that we're describing as evil.
Let's go on to the next question because there's lots.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm pretty convinced by your conclusions that evil is meaninglessness. But I'm wondering if it doesn't lead us to some a little confusing conclusions. The first one is when we agree that evil is meaninglessness and human beings are creatures that seek for meaning, don't we have to agree strong anthropological optimism that we are necessarily good as human beings? And the second, when you combine it with entropy and wastefulness in the nature, don't we also have to say that all natural processes are necessarily evil?
No, we don't have to say that all natural processes are necessarily evil at all, I don't think. Natural processes include all the synthetic ones, so they're there. And actually, human beings coming along seeking to make, or just life existing, in a sense, gives meaning to that meaninglessness. Because it's, life can only exist because of the increase of entropy. So in a sense, the presence of life in the universe has already redeemed that futility,
Okay.
is an argument.
Who's next? So if you manage to pass it back to
Could somebody get me a glass of water? I'm drying up a bit.
we can definitely make that happen.
Thank you.
You can pass that to Mick while I'm still here, or Jonathan. Do we have glasses? We've got the glass though. Look at that amazing
Amazing,
collaboration.
fantastic.
Now, was it the gentleman in the purple sweater? Yeah.
Hi, I just want to say thanks for the presentation. Definitely has given us a lot to think about. I guess I have a two-part question. Part A is, haven't you really just moved the question of what evil is to what meaninglessness is?
Mhm.
That seems to effectively, we don't know what evil is any more than we did before, since
Okay.
now we just have a different term to describe
Okay.
the situation that in the past would be called evil, now we call it meaninglessness.
Mhm.
Is that really that significant? And then two, as some people have started to point out, it is, if you define it as meaninglessness, that is something that is psychologically processed, right?
Mhm.
It only exists within a human mind. So
Mhm.
like if we say life, we don't mean any life existing gives meaning to the universe, but only the conscious recognition that something is alive. Because let's say there's a plant that has no consciousness,
Mhm.
and that's the only thing that ever came to exist in
Mhm.
the world. Is all the world evil? Maybe not, but all the world's meaninglessness because it's never
Okay.
kind of recognized as
Okay.
anything. In a similar way,
Okay.
not that I would want to defend the Holocaust, but like there's plenty of fan fiction where the Germans win the war.
Uh-huh.
All the
Sure.
Jews are eradicated,
Yeah.
everybody dies, and
Yeah.
it's completely celebrated. Nobody
Yeah.
recognizes it as evil.
Yes.
They
Yes.
don't see it as pointless. They
Mhm.
all see it as
Yeah.
an achievement of true human progress.
Mhm.
But I think everybody in this room would say, oh, well, that's still obviously evil.
Mhm.
But that only works if there's something more to evil than pure conscious recognition of
Okay.
something as evil.
Mhm. Okay. On the question of does it need to be conscious life in order to redeem the futility, I'd say no. I'd be quite absolutist about it, because entropy is a physical process, and life driving those synthetic reactions is therefore overcoming that. So if the plant is good, and I'd suggest it is, then the universe is a good place as a consequence of having that one plant in it. So I'd be absolutist about that. The other thing was about whether all I've done is replace religion with meaninglessness,
Or evil.
evil with meaninglessness.
Meaninglessness.
I'm trying to kind of give a kind of definition for what we mean by evil and how it shatters our moral categories. I wanted to leave open. I guess the kind of I guess what you're hinting at is am I just making it a relativistic term? And I wanted to leave that open. Really.
I guess I'm kind of saying you're sneaking in other categories.
Okay.
Like you're like, well, the non-aware life is good. So
Oh.
you've already used another
Okay,
category, right?
okay.
So
Yeah.
you can't get rid of
Yes.
those categories and then bring them back in.
Okay.
There was someone tweeted, a philosopher the other day, if someone accuses your account of something as being circular, you can always say it's non-reductive.
I don't mean to be too difficult.
Sorry.
No, it's
Come back on
interesting.
to that.
Well, I don't think I'm sneaking the categories back in through the back door. What I was suggesting when I was saying that evil breaks our moral categories is that it somehow it won't be contained within them. It doesn't mean to say that I wasn't intending to say that we can't use those categories to try and comprehend what's going on. We just need to recognise the limits. And in terms of consciousness, if there is no consciousness, there's no awareness of evil. So in that sense, we'd need something like us to have any, something capable of having a concept to understand what it is. So it's in that sense, evil depends on there being something like us in the universe.
And in that sense, not that metaphysical.
Possibly, but then, I think what's metaphysics if not just human understandings of trying to understand the fundamental nature of the universe? Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Things are getting pretty deep, and we'll have to move on to the next question. You might be able to come back to this. And go ahead.
If you project yourself into 100 years' time, I just wondered, what might seem quite meaningful to us now, then might seem evil because it's meaningless to. I mean, you more or less said that about the Holocaust, and presumably they have meaning. And I just see it gives me a rather unsure feeling. Well, what are we doing now, which in 100 years' time will be seen as evil?
Okay, but I don't think anybody. Not everybody accepts that. Not everybody considered the Holocaust or the final solution something worth doing at the time. It's not that the things that we're doing now that we think are good will suddenly in a few centuries' time, whatever, we'll think as evil. I think it's more that our understandings of evil shift, and we begin to understand. We draw out different dimensions of it. I don't think it's. Take the Lisbon Earthquake. It's not that we suddenly think that people going to praying in church on All Saints' Day was a pointless or evil activity. It's just that activity was part of an understanding of the structure, the ordering of the world, which the event of the Lisbon Earthquake shattered. And so evil begins how people make meaning and create meaning in the face of evil changes, shifts. And so rather than seeing it in a context of divine providence and care and judgment, it suddenly becomes one of human progress. It's not that people stop doing something that post-earthquake, or stop doing something post-earthquake that they now consider evil. It's not that. It's just that it's a different way of trying to understand and give meaning to what's happening to them.
Okay, we'll have to move on. We missed out Samuel Hughes' question here, so if we can get the mic back, and we will get back around all the way, but I don't want to allow this process to be wasteful or involve any other.
So thank you, it's tremendously interesting, and I think a real step forward for the debate. And I have a question which is maybe related to the gentleman in the purple jumpers here, his question. So I want to hear a bit more about meaninglessness. What is meaninglessness? So I'm thinking, one definition that I don't know if this is what you want to say. One definition someone might infer from what you've said is, even it doesn't even make sense on account of the perpetrator's motives. There's no possible motivation for it. I think that can't be right, because with the Holocaust, I think, so I do want to disagree. Within the twisted logic of the regime, actually it's quite easy to justify the Holocaust, and it was a partial success. So now you want to say, well, the problem is that logic, there's something about that logic which makes this meaningless, whereas other actions by bad regimes that are nevertheless not evil are somehow different. but I want to hear a bit more about what that would be. So it can't just be, what it can't just be is that the Nazism is immoral, or that the basic motives of the Nazi regime were bad, because then it collapses back into a morality account. So it has to be something not just that the Nazism is an immoral system, it has to be there's something special about the motives of the Nazis that mean that the kind of justification that you could give for their crimes within that system nevertheless is not such as to make those crimes meaningful. So I think, I mean, I find the account very promising, or very, something very attractive about it, but I want to get that sort of detail, fiddle with that detail.
Okay, so I mean, is what you're asking me, how do we counter what we consider an evil regime's logic? Yeah? How do we justify our value judgment of it? Is that?
No, not that. I mean, how do we get to meaninglessness? So, if it's not just that the evil regime has, let's see. It's not that there's no justification that the evil regime can give at all. They can give a justification within their own terms. But we want to say there's something about those terms which makes it nevertheless a meaningless act.
Right.
To work out what that is.
So we need to find a way of making it meaningless within that worldview.
Something like that?
Something like that.
I don't know. Or something about that worldview which means that a justification within that worldview isn't enough to get us to meaningfulness.
Right. Yes. It's a good question. I'm not sure I've got an entire answer to it. I'm not sure I've got an answer to any of the questions I've been asked. But I think I would. I mean, within the system, you can begin to challenge even the logic itself and say, So I mean, and you can begin to say, ask. Even within that system, you can ask the question: what will actually be achieved if we achieve the goal? You maybe begin there. But that sounds quite lame and quite liberal in the face of something that's quite stark and I can't think of another word other than evil.
I don't know, maybe it's a promising start. I mean, maybe there are differences between systems of thought we disagree with, but think nevertheless they've got some kind of internal sort of seriousness.
Yeah. I think if you've got two different systems and you can make connections across the two, then you've got a basis for critique, and that sounds like it's a nice intellectual game we're playing, but you've got a basis in which to make judgments and counterclaims from that logic. If they're completely isolated and you've just got a relativist system, then I don't see how, other than calling it out from your perspective, I can't see how else you can do it. So meaninglessness is culturally embedded. So unless if you can make connections across cultures and systems, then you can begin to unravel what from our perspective is a twisted logic, and you can begin to challenge it from that point and expose it from there.
I'm sure you're onto something here.
Yeah.
Well, we'll have to talk about it afterwards.
Yeah, I'd like to.
We're going to try as quickly as possible to get into the last couple of questions. I think maybe it was the lady with the red scarf was holding it, but maybe she didn't have a question. You were just passing it. So yeah, go ahead. And then yourself, and then you two.
Great talk, Mark. Thank you so much. I was just wondering if this only works if evil is necessary for the good that comes after it. Because if not, then isn't the suffering itself actually futile and will always be evil? Because if there was another way that the person could get to the same sense of meaning without the suffering at all, does that make it always eternally an evil?
I think, if good results from some evil, then there's a sense in which that evil is redeemed in a sense. And it lessens the sting of the evil. So my suggestion is that if nothing good comes out of it, then it remains as it is, evil with nothing to say for it that comes out of it, and that to me intensifies the suffering. It's giving something positive constructive meaning which draws the sting from the evil. So if you can't bring good out of it, then it stays. That's what it is, and that's the final word. And the thing that I find slightly troubling about the position I've arrived at is it does rather suggest that ultimately that's the answer we have to come to rest at.
We'll have to keep the questions and answers fairly short just to make sure everyone gets to leave around the moment. But go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, this one is related to the last thing you were saying about. Could you please clarify a little bit what you understand by meaning making in this case? Because I think that you could have many senses of meaning making.
Yeah.
Some of them more like Viktor Frankl's. He gave a whole meaning of his life and the significance of that.
Yeah.
Because in certain ways of meaning making, I think it could be very problematic, that account.
Yeah, okay. I think what I have in mind is something like giving some positive significance to an event, drawing something that the person considers good. That having gone through an experience, they feel that they've learned something from it, that they've created some kind of significance from it, that they're, if we're talking about people, that they're different, if you like, better people as a consequence.
Okay, we'll have to move on to the next question, but
So giving positive significance to something is what I'm driving at.
Part of my question has been answered already through different people. The general concept of evil is bad.
Mm-hmm.
But probably deliberately you haven't used the word bad throughout your whole talk.
No.
And it relates to your concept of evil, which is privation of meaning. Yeah. Privation of meaning doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad. It could be neutral. It could be meaningless to one side. It could be meaningful to other side.
Mm-hmm.
So evil could be good to one side, it could be bad to other side.
Mm-hmm.
Would you like to?
I think it relates to the kind of discussion we were having just then about...
symmetric railcar problem.
Say again?
The symmetric railcar problem. If you've got equal parties, equal opposite parties on either side of the railcar.
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
I think are we talking about the meaninglessness or the meaningfulness being the result of actually if you suffer I benefit, or so it's that kind of thing. I'm not allowed to inflict suffering on you in order for me to benefit. You are allowed to sacrifice yourself for my benefit. That would be a morally meaningful situation. But I'm not allowed to inflict suffering on you for my benefit. If you're talking about two people undergo the same experience, and one finds in it positive meaning, and the other finds it meaningless, then I think the solution to that is if it's two groups of people, the solution is like I was suggesting in the discussion just then. The solution is to meet and find the common ground, and move forward in a it's almost Hegelian synthesis and antithesis, and move forward together.
Well, we'll have to move on to the last and final question.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm worried by where you're going there. My kind of ordinary understanding of immoral acts are those that don't take any account of others' suffering, whereas an evil act being one that actually intends the suffering of the other, the pain or loss of dignity or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Let's imagine I'm a psychopath, and I deal with my unconscious hopelessness and despair and terror by projecting it into you. You know, you're my victim or something. Now I thereby relieve myself of it, and I actively intend you to kind of suffer. My own suffering is in some sense kind of diminished in that way because of the projective identification in play. It seems to me very natural, but rather than think we should meet and discuss the kind of present, the last time we'd just say this person's evil, and they're evil because they're actively intending another's suffering. We're talking about non-natural evil in this ordinary sense of non-natural evil, whereas In moral, the implicature when you said we did use the word bad in your talk, because you're talking about immoral acts being,
Morally bad.
really bad, but that doesn't get to it. But I just suggest that the point is that when you say something's immoral, the implicature, the tacit implicature there is that they're being utterly thoughtless about the effects of the act, rather than actually intending, which negates the idea of intending the acts, which is what the concept of evil, I think, normally we thought to get to.
So what immoral acts are thoughtless, but evil acts are thoughtful. There's an intention behind it.
Thoughtful would be a word we want to use consciously.
Yeah, I'm putting a I'm putting a hyphen between.
Suffering, loss of, in separate of either pain or loss of doom.
Okay.
That would be the ordinary language kind of thought.
Right. Okay, but that's Claudia Card's paradigm. I think that there's a decision, a culpable decision that makes it knowing that the suffering is going to result. That's what qualifies as evil for Claudia Card.
Intending the suffering or knowing it's going to result?
Well, either I guess will do in Claudia Card's case. But just it's just if someone has an intention to harm someone, I get that they have an intention and a purpose and a meaning to it, but that doesn't mean to say that we don't have to recognise that as a valid reason and valid meaning, do we? You get wanting to kind of get temporary relief from your not you but somebody from their internal angst and suffering. It's a meaningless by doing something to somebody else. It's actually quite meaningless because it's not going to actually fix the problem. Yes, yeah. Do you see what I mean? So in that sense, it's meaningless.
I'll have to cut you off there. I can see there's more discussion to be had on that point. Likewise, there is further opportunity for discussion. Now, we'd like to invite you all to stick around for a glass of wine and a chat. And Mark will probably be willing to field further questions informally. And if he's not willing, there's not really a way out of the rules I've made. So it might have to happen anyway. But before we do finish, I'd like to ask you to join me once again in thanking Mark for a really interesting talk.